In 1889, when Thomas Garrett had nothing left but 50 cents and worn-out boots, everyone called him a fool for buying the abandoned Whispering Pines Trail Lodge. The crumbling building sat deep in the Colorado mountains, untouched for 20 years after its mysterious closure. Local folks warned him about strange sounds and missing travelers. But Thomas had nowhere else to go. On his first night, while prying open warped floorboards to make repairs, his crowbar struck something solid beneath the rotting wood. What he pulled from that hidden space would change everything. Leather journals filled with coded entries, detailed maps of secret routes, and artifacts that proved the lodge had been far more than a simple waystation. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. What secret had the previous owners died protecting? And why were powerful men from back east suddenly interested in Thomas's worthless purchase? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas Garrett had stepped off the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad with empty pockets and a rumbling stomach. The conductor's sympathetic nod told him everything about his appearance: threadbare coat, holes in his boots, and the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd lost everything. The mining camp of Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. But it was the end of the line, literally and figuratively, and Thomas had nowhere else to go. He'd spent his last dollar on the train ticket west, leaving behind the ruins of his life in Kansas. The drought had taken his farm, the bank had taken his house, and consumption had taken his wife Sarah 2 winters back. At 43, he felt ancient, worn down by loss and failure. The land office sat wedged between Murphy's General Store and a saloon called The Broken Wheel. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Properties available. Inquire within." Thomas pushed through the door, setting a brass bell jangling overhead. Jeremiah Pike, the land agent, looked up from his ledger with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too many desperate souls pass through his office. His spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at least twice, and his vest strained against a belly built on whiskey and disappointment. "Help you, mister? I'm looking for property. Something cheap." Thomas pulled his last 50 cents from his pocket, the coins warm from his palm. "Real cheap." Pike's laugh was more bark than humor. 50 cents? You might buy yourself a beer with that, but property? This ain't charity, friend." Thomas straightened his shoulders, summoning what dignity he had left. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking what 50 cents might purchase in these parts." Pike studied him for a long moment, then shrugged and pulled out a thick book bound in cracked leather. He flipped through pages covered in spidery handwriting, muttering under his breath. "Well now," Pike said, stopping at a particular entry. "There is one property. Been on the books for near 20 years. Nobody fool enough to take it." He looked up with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Course, there's reasons for that." "What kind of reasons?" "The Whispering Pines Trail Lodge, about 15 miles up the old mining road. Built in '68 by a fellow named Samuel Hartwell. Ran it as a way station for travelers heading to the high country mines. Good business for a while, steady stream of prospectors and supply wagons." Pike leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "Then one day in '69, Hartwell just vanished. Left everything behind. Clothes in the wardrobe, food on the table, money in the cash box. Just gone, like he'd walked out to check the weather and never came back." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the office windows. What happened to him? Nobody knows. Some say Indians got him, others reckon he fell down a mine shaft or got ate by a bear. But the strangest part is what happened after. 3 different men tried to run the lodge over the years. Every one of them disappeared too, leaving all their belongings behind, just like Hartwell. Pike flipped to another page, revealing what looked like an official document covered in stamps and seals. The territorial government finally condemned the property in '74, declared it a public hazard. Been sitting empty ever since, and you're willing to sell it for 50 cents? Hell, I'd pay you 50 cents to take it off the books. Been nothing but a headache for years. What with folks asking questions and the territorial inspector coming around every few years. To make sure it's still standing, Pike dipped his pen in an inkwell and began filling out forms with practiced efficiency. Of course, there's conditions. Property sells as is, no guarantees about structural soundness or clear title. And there's some unusual clauses in the original deed that I don't rightly understand. Thomas examined the deed when Pike slid it across the desk. The document was written in formal legal language, but certain phrases stood out. Contingent upon maintenance of existing structures and preservation of all contents therein, and transfer of ownership includes all rights, privileges and obligations as outlined in supplementary agreements filed under territorial seal. What does this mean about supplementary agreements? Pike shrugged. Legal nonsense, most likely. Hartwell was particular about his paperwork, filed every document in triplicate, probably just covering himself in case the territorial government tried to seize the property for unpaid taxes. Thomas signed his name with a steady hand, though his heart hammered against his ribs. 50 cents for 15 miles of isolation and whatever secrets the abandoned lodge might hold. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan he had. "Congratulations," Pike said, handing over a brass key that looked old enough to predate statehood. "You're now the proud owner of the most haunted property in 3 counties. The key felt warm in Thomas's palm, heavier than its size suggested. As he stepped back into the mountain afternoon, he wondered if he'd just made the smartest decision of his life or signed his own death warrant. The 15-mile journey to Whispering Pines took Thomas the better part of 2 days on foot, following a rutted wagon road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Fallen trees blocked sections of the path, and washouts from spring snowmelt had carved deep gullies that forced him to detour through dense stands of pine and aspen. When the lodge finally came into view, Thomas understood why nobody wanted the property. The 2-story log structure sagged like an old man's shoulders, its roof missing shingles and its windows dark as dead eyes. A covered porch wrapped around the front, supported by posts that had shifted enough to give the whole building a drunken lean, but the bones were solid. Thomas could see that much even from a distance. The foundation stones were massive, quarried from local granite and fitted with the precision of a man who built for permanence. The logs themselves were thick-cut lodgepole pine, darkened by weather but still sound. The front door stood slightly ajar, hanging on leather hinges that had survived 2 decades of mountain weather. Thomas pushed it open with the brass key Pike had given him, though the lock had long since rusted beyond use. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that slanted through gaps in the shuttered windows. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and a bar running along another. Tables and chairs sat arranged as if customers might walk in at any moment. Though everything was covered in the grey shroud of abandonment, Thomas's footsteps echoed on wide plank floors as he explored the ground level. A kitchen occupied the back corner, complete with a cast-iron stove and a hand pump that drew water from what must be a well beneath the building. Upstairs, he found 6 small rooms that had served as lodging for travelers, each furnished with a simple bed and washstand. In what appeared to be the proprietor's private quarters, Thomas discovered the first real clues about Samuel Hartwell. A wardrobe still contained clothes, wool pants, cotton shirts, a heavy winter coat that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. A shaving kit sat on the washstand, the razor sharp enough to suggest Hartwell had maintained his equipment even as he planned his mysterious departure. But it was the books that caught Thomas's attention. Hartwell's shelves held an unusual collection: surveying manuals, geological texts, treatises on mining law, and several volumes on cryptography and coded communications. Not the typical reading material for a man running a remote waystation. As evening approached, Thomas made a fire in the kitchen stove and heated a can of beans he'd purchased in Cedar Falls. The lodge came alive with settling sounds as the temperature dropped: creaking timbers, sighing wind through loose chinking, the occasional skitter of small animals in the walls. It was while clearing debris from the main room floor that his boot heel caught on a loose board. Thomas knelt and pried at the plank with his pocket knife, revealing a gap just wide enough for a man's hand. His fingers touched something solid in the darkness below. The object that emerged was a leather-wrapped bundle, tied with rawhide and sealed with wax that had hardened to the consistency of stone. Thomas carried it to the kitchen table and carefully worked the bindings loose, his heart racing with anticipation. Inside were 3 items that would change everything he thought he knew about Samuel Hartwell and the Whispering Pines Lodge. The first was a leather journal, its pages covered in neat handwriting that used symbols instead of letters. The second was a map drawn on heavy paper, showing not just the local area, but a network of trails and locations marked with cryptic notations. The third item made Thomas's hands shake as he held it up to the lamplight. It was a photograph of 5 men standing in front of the lodge, but not as Thomas had found it. In the photograph, the building looked new, well-maintained and bustling with activity. Wagons loaded with covered cargo sat in the yard, and the men wore the practical clothes of teamsters or freight handlers, but it was the notation on the back of the photograph that sent ice through Thomas's veins. Hartwell's Rangers, Operation Mountain Gate, September 1868. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, last known photo, all presumed dead. Thomas spread the map across the table, using his lamp to illuminate the strange symbols that marked locations throughout the territory. Whatever Samuel Hartwell had been doing at Whispering Pines, it hadn't been running a simple roadhouse for travelers. The evidence suggested something far more complex and dangerous. As wind howled around the lodge's eaves, Thomas studied the coded journal by lamplight, trying to decipher symbols that seemed to dance before his tired eyes. He was no longer just the owner of an abandoned building. He was the keeper of secrets that men had died to protect. The question that haunted him as he finally sought his bed in Hartwell's old room was simple but terrifying. If 5 armed men had vanished without a trace, what chance did one desperate farmer have of surviving whatever had claimed them? Thomas spent his first week at the lodge, making basic repairs and trying to decipher Hartwell's coded journal. The symbols remained stubbornly mysterious, though he'd begun to recognize patterns that suggested a substitution cipher of some kind. But without the key, the journal's secrets stayed locked away. Growing frustrated with his isolation, Thomas decided to return to Cedar Falls for supplies and information. The photograph of Hartwell's Rangers haunted him, especially the notation about all 5 men being presumed dead. If he was going to survive at the lodge, he needed to understand what had happened to his predecessors. The town's newspaper office occupied a narrow building between the bank and the telegraph station. A weathered sign proclaimed it home to the Cedar Falls. Clarion, weekly voice of the territory. Thomas pushed through the door to find a cluttered room dominated by a massive printing press that looked like it had survived several wars. Ezra Whitman, the editor and apparently the entire staff, emerged from behind stacks of paper with ink-stained fingers and suspicious eyes. He was a small man, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors, wrestling with words and deadlines. Help you, stranger. I'm looking for back issues from around 1869, specifically anything about Samuel Hartwell or the Whispering Pines Lodge. Whitman's expression shifted from suspicion to interest. Hartwell, eh? You're not the first to come asking about him. What's your interest? I bought the property, trying to understand what happened there. Bought it. Whitman let out a low whistle. Pike finally found someone foolish enough to take that place off his hands. Well, you'll want the October 1869 issues. That's when the whole mess started. Whitman led Thomas to a wall lined with bound volumes of past editions. He pulled down a thick book and flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. Here we go. October 15th, 1869. He pointed to a headline that made Thomas's blood run cold. Local businessman missing, foul play suspected. The article described how Samuel Hartwell had failed to appear for a scheduled business meeting in town. When concerned associates rode out to check on him, they found the lodge abandoned but undisturbed. Food sat half-eaten on the table. Hartwell's personal effects remained in his room, and the cash box held nearly $200. But that's not the strange part. Whitman continued, flipping pages. Look at this. The next article, dated a week later, bore the headline, "Second Disappearance at Cursed Lodge." It detailed how Jacob Brennan, a teamster from Denver, had volunteered to manage the property until Hartwell's fate could be determined. Brennan had lasted exactly 6 days before vanishing under identical circumstances. And here's number 3, Whitman said, indicating another story. Marcus Cole, territorial deputy. Tough as nails, fought Indians and outlaws for 15 years. Lasted 4 days. Thomas studied the photograph accompanying Cole's story. The deputy was a large man with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to violence. Not the type to disappear without a fight. What about the other 2? The photo I found mentioned 5 men. Whitman raised an eyebrow. You found a photograph? Interesting. The other 2 weren't locals. Daniel Reeves and Thomas Morrison came through town in summer of '68, said they were surveyors working for the territorial government. Spent a lot of time with Hartwell before heading up to the lodge. He pulled down another volume, this one from 1868. Here's the only mention of them. Reeves filed a claim for mineral rights on Hartwell's property, but the paperwork was never completed. When the territorial office tried to follow up months later, nobody could locate either man. Thomas felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Mineral rights? What kind of minerals? Gold, mostly. Maybe silver. The whole area was lousy with prospectors in those days, especially after the strike at Cripple Creek. But Reeves's claim was different. He filed for exclusive extraction rights to something called rare earth deposits, whatever those are. Whitman showed Thomas a copy of the filing, its formal language dense with legal terminology. But one phrase stood out: subsurface deposits of significant strategic value to territorial defense and development. Strategic value? What could that mean? Nobody knew then, and I still don't know now. But I'll tell you something interesting. Whitman leaned closer, lowering his voice. Every few years, men come through town asking the same questions you're asking. Well-dressed fellows with expensive horses and government credentials. They always want to know about Hartwell, about the lodge, about anyone who might have information. When was the last time? 3 months ago. 2 men from back east said they represented mining interests. Asked a lot of questions about property ownership and whether anyone had tried to file new claims on Hartwell's land. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the newspaper office's thin walls. Someone was still interested in the lodge's secrets, even after 20 years. Did you tell them about Pike selling the property? Whitman shook his head. Didn't know about that myself until today. But if those fellows are still around, they'll hear about your purchase soon enough. News travels fast in a small town. Thomas thanked Whitman and prepared to leave. But the editor caught his arm. Mister, I don't know what you're looking for up at that lodge, but 5 good men have already disappeared trying to find it. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried. As Thomas walked back toward the mountain road, he carried a newspaper clipping in his pocket and a growing certainty that he was walking into something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Back at the lodge, Thomas began a systematic search of the building, armed with new knowledge about Hartwell's mysterious business. If the man had been involved in mineral extraction and government contracts, there had to be more evidence hidden somewhere in the structure. It was while examining the kitchen more carefully that Thomas noticed irregularities in the floorboards. Several planks near the back wall showed different wear patterns, as if they'd been removed and replaced multiple times. Using his crowbar, he pried up a section of flooring to reveal not just a crawl space, but the entrance to a carefully constructed basement. Stone steps led down into darkness that swallowed his lantern light. The air below carried scents of dry earth and something else, something metallic that made his nose wrinkle. Thomas descended slowly, his footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The basement stretched beneath most of the lodge's footprint, its walls carved from solid rock and reinforced with timber supports. But this wasn't a simple root cellar or storage area. The space had been designed for serious work, with multiple chambers branching off from a central corridor. The first room Thomas entered took his breath away. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding an assortment of equipment that belonged in a laboratory rather than a frontier lodge. Glass bottles filled with various chemicals sat in careful rows, their contents labeled in Hartwell's precise handwriting. Scales, measuring devices and instruments Thomas couldn't identify occupied a workbench that ran along one wall, but it was the maps that truly captured his attention. Dozens of them covered every available wall space, showing not just the local area, but territories throughout the West. Red pins marked specific locations, connected by colored string that traced routes across hundreds of miles. Notes in Hartwell's handwriting provided details about distances, elevation changes, and what appeared to be travel times between various points. In the center of the room sat a large table, covered with hand-drawn diagrams that showed the underground layout of the lodge and surrounding area. Thomas realized he was looking at engineering plans for an extensive tunnel system that extended far beyond the basement where he stood. Following the diagrams, Thomas discovered that the basement's rear wall contained a concealed door. Hidden behind a carefully arranged stack of supply boxes, the entrance led to a tunnel that sloped downward into the mountain itself. The passage was wide enough for a man with a loaded pack, its walls shored up with timber and stones that spoke of permanent construction rather than temporary excavation. Thomas followed the tunnel for nearly 100 yards before it opened into a natural cave system. His lantern light revealed a space large enough to house several wagons, with evidence that it had been used for exactly that purpose. Wheel ruts marked the stone floor, and iron rings set into the walls could have secured cargo or livestock. But the most remarkable discovery waited in the cave's deepest recess. Stacked against the far wall were wooden crates bearing stenciled markings that identified their contents as surveying equipment, mining tools, and something labeled special materials, handled with extreme care. The crates looked untouched since Hartwell's disappearance, their contents preserved in the cave's constant temperature and low humidity. Thomas pried open one of the special materials crates, revealing metal ingots unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were lighter than iron, but heavier than aluminum, with a distinctive blue-green tinge that caught his lantern light in strange ways. Each ingot bore stamped markings that included what appeared to be government codes and dates from 1868. Inside the same crate, wrapped in oiled cloth, Thomas found a document that made his hands shake as he read it. The paper bore the seal of the United States Geological Survey and was signed by officials he'd never heard of, but the contents were clear enough. It was a certification that the metals in question had been extracted from deposits of significant strategic value and were designated for exclusive government use in territorial defense. Applications. The document went on to describe the metals as rare earth elements essential for advanced metallurgy and communications equipment. Thomas didn't understand the technical language, but he grasped the implications. Hartwell hadn't been running a simple mining operation. He'd been extracting materials that the government considered vital to national security. A folder beneath the certification contained correspondence between Hartwell and officials in Washington, discussing production quotas, delivery schedules, and payment arrangements that involved sums large enough to make Thomas dizzy. The letters revealed that Hartwell's operation was part of a classified program to secure strategic materials from Western territories before they achieved statehood. But the final document in the folder changed everything. Thomas thought he understood about Hartwell's disappearance. It was a letter dated just days before the man vanished, warning that unauthorized Parties have discovered the operation, and that the immediate evacuation protocol should be implemented to protect both personnel and materials. This letter was signed by someone identified only as Colonel Morrison, Department of the Interior, and it ended with a chilling instruction: destroy all evidence of extraction activities and relocate to secondary site. No trace of operation must remain for hostile discovery. Thomas sat in the darkness of the hidden cave, surrounded by crates of mysterious metals and evidence of government conspiracy, understanding finally that Samuel Hartwell hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been following orders to vanish, taking with him secrets that someone had considered worth killing for. Thomas spent the next morning searching through the remaining crates, where he discovered correspondence that revealed the true scope of Hartwell's operation. Hidden beneath layers of mining equipment were dozens of letters between Hartwell and executives from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, discussing arrangements that went far beyond simple freight shipping. The letters painted a picture of elaborate logistics involving special cargo that moved along predetermined routes during specific time frames. Railroad officials had arranged for dedicated cars, trusted conductors, and modified schedules that allowed sensitive materials to travel without official documentation or inspection. One letter from Railroad Superintendent William Clayton, dated March 1868, was particularly revealing. The arrangement you've proposed meets our requirements for discretion. Our modified freight cars can accommodate up to 2 tons of your special materials per shipment, with delivery to designated terminals in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo. Payment, as discussed, will be made through the intermediary accounts you've established. Thomas found shipping manifests that showed regular departments from a siding near the lodge, though he'd seen no evidence of railroad infrastructure in the area. The manifests listed cargo as geological specimens and surveying equipment, but the weights and shipping precautions suggested something far more valuable and sensitive. A map tucked between the shipping documents showed a narrow gauge rail line that branched off from the main Denver and Rio Grande route, about 5 miles east of the lodge. The spur line wasn't marked on any official railroad maps Thomas had seen, which suggested it had been built specifically for Hartwell's operation and later abandoned or concealed. The most intriguing correspondence came from someone identified as Agent Harrison, writing from the territorial capital. His letters discussed coordination with federal authorities and ensuring continued cooperation from local officials. One passage made Thomas's skin crawl. The territorial governor has been briefed on the strategic importance of your operation. Local law enforcement has been instructed to provide assistance as requested and to avoid unnecessary investigation of activities in your operational area. This explained much about the newspaper accounts Thomas had read. If local authorities had been instructed to avoid investigating the lodge, it was no wonder that the disappearances had been treated as isolated incidents rather than connected events requiring serious inquiry. But it was a letter from late 1868 that revealed the growing danger Hartwell faced. Agent Harrison wrote, "We have confirmation that Confederate agents are operating in the territory, seeking information about federal resource extraction activities. Additionally, foreign interests, possibly British or French, have been identified attempting to locate and compromise strategic material sources. Your security protocol should be elevated immediately." The final piece of the railroad puzzle came in a leather portfolio that contained engineering drawings for the secret spur line. The documents showed how the railroad had been built, using a combination of tunnels and bridges that allowed trains to reach the lodge area without being visible from the main road or nearby settlements. The construction had been a marvel of discreet engineering, designed to move valuable cargo without attracting attention. Thomas studied a detailed cross-section drawing that showed how the rail line connected to the underground storage areas he discovered. A loading platform had been built inside the mountain itself, allowing cargo to be transferred from the caves directly onto specially modified freight cars. The entire operation could have functioned without anyone in the outside world, knowing that trains were regularly visiting the supposedly isolated lodge. But the drawings also revealed something ominous. Notations in red ink, added later than the original plans, showed demolition points throughout the rail system. Someone had planned to destroy the secret infrastructure, and based on the dates, the planning had occurred just before Hartwell's disappearance. A separate folder contained what appeared to be the final communications between Hartwell and his government contacts. The tone of these letters was increasingly urgent, with references to compromised security and immediate threat assessment. One telegram, dated just 3 days before Hartwell vanished, was particularly chilling. Operation Mountain Gate terminated. Implement destruction protocol immediately. Exfiltration team en route. The telegram was signed with the code name Sierra 1 and included coordinates that Thomas recognized as marking a location about 10 miles north of the lodge. If an exfiltration team had been sent to extract Hartwell and his materials, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Thomas found one final document that made his blood run cold. It was a handwritten note in Hartwell's careful script, apparently written in haste. "They found us. Harrison was wrong about local security. Someone leaked information about the shipments. Morrison and Reeves are dead. I'm destroying the rail access and sealing the primary cache. If anyone finds this, trust no one from the territorial government." The corruption goes deeper than we knew. As Thomas sat in the hidden laboratory, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and betrayal, he understood that he wasn't just dealing with an abandoned mining operation. He was sitting on the remnants of a classified government program that had been compromised by enemy agents, corrupt officials, and forces that had been willing to kill to protect their secrets. The question now was whether those same forces were still active, and whether his purchase of the lodge had put him in the crosshairs of people who had already proven they would stop at nothing to control Hartwell's legacy. Thomas emerged from the underground chambers as the sun set. Behind the western peaks, his mind reeling from everything he'd discovered. The lodge no longer felt like a refuge from his past failures, but like a trap that was slowly closing around him. As he secured the hidden entrance and tried to restore the kitchen floor to its normal appearance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That feeling proved justified when he spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the tree line about a quarter-mile to the east. Someone had made camp within sight of the lodge, and Thomas doubted it was a coincidence. He extinguished his own lamp and moved to a window that offered a view of the area where he'd seen the smoke. 2 men sat around a small fire, their horses picketed nearby. Even in the gathering darkness, Thomas could see they were well equipped for mountain travel, with quality gear and weapons that suggested they weren't ordinary drifters. One of the men periodically raised what appeared to be field glasses, scanning the lodge and surrounding area. Thomas spent a sleepless night taking turns between watching the camp and studying Hartwell's coded journal by candlelight. He'd begun to recognize some of the symbols, particularly those that appeared to reference dates and locations. But without the cipher key, most of the journal remained frustratingly opaque. Morning brought an unwelcome discovery. Tacked to the lodge's front door was a note written in block letters on expensive paper. "Mr. Garrett, your recent purchase has attracted attention from parties with legitimate interests in this property. We represent investors who may be willing to offer significant compensation for your cooperation. Meet us at the old mineshaft 2 miles north at sunset today. Come alone and bring any documents you may have found." The note was unsigned, but its tone carried an implicit threat that made Thomas's hands shake as he read it. The men who'd been watching the lodge weren't casual observers. They knew who he was. They knew he'd been exploring the property, and they expected him to cooperate with whatever plans they had for Hartwell's legacy. Thomas considered his options while making coffee with hands that trembled despite his efforts to stay calm. He could try to reach town and seek help from the sheriff, but Hartwell's papers had made it clear that local authorities couldn't be trusted. He could flee, abandoning the lodge and everything he'd discovered, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation with people who clearly had resources to track him wherever he went. Or he could keep the appointment and try to learn more about who these people were and what they really wanted. It was the most dangerous option, but it was also the only one that might give him some control over his situation. As he prepared for the meeting, Thomas made careful preparations. He selected several of Hartwell's less important documents to take with him, keeping the most sensitive materials hidden in the underground chambers. He also took one of the strange metal ingots, wrapped in cloth and tucked into his coat pocket. If these people were after Hartwell's materials, he wanted proof of what he'd found. The abandoned mine shaft they'd specified wasn't hard to locate. It sat in a clearing that had been carved from the forest decades earlier, its wooden headframe still standing despite years of weather and neglect. Thomas arrived early and positioned himself where he could observe the approach routes while remaining concealed. The two men who appeared at sunset matched his expectations. Both were well dressed despite their camping in the wilderness, with the confident bearing of people accustomed to getting their way. The older of the two, a man in his 50s with graying hair and expensive boots, took the lead in their conversation. "Mr. Garrett, thank you for coming. I'm James Davidson, and this is my associate, Mr. Reynolds. We represent a consortium of investors with interests in historical properties and mineral rights." Thomas stepped into the clearing, keeping his distance but trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Your note mentioned compensation for cooperation. What kind of cooperation?" Davidson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Direct and to the point. I appreciate that in a businessman. We're aware that your property contains certain artifacts left behind by the previous owner. Our clients are prepared to offer substantial sums for access to those materials." "What kind of materials?" "Documents, maps, any physical specimens that Samuel Hartwell may have collected during his time at the lodge. Our clients are historians and collectors who value items with unique provenance." Reynolds, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. "We're also prepared to offer you a very generous price for the property itself. Far more than the 50 cents you paid for it." Thomas felt ice in his veins. These men knew exactly how much he'd paid for the lodge, which meant they'd been investigating him long before he'd discovered their presence. Their resources and information-gathering capabilities suggested they were far more than simple collectors or investors. "I'm not interested in selling." Davidson's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Garrett, I don't think you understand the situation you found yourself in. That property contains materials that certain parties consider to be stolen government assets. Your continued possession of those materials could be interpreted as a federal crime. Are you federal agents? We represent interests that have been authorized to recover property that was illegally removed from government custody. Your cooperation would be viewed favorably by those authorities." Thomas pulled the wrapped metal ingot from his pocket, noting how both men's eyes immediately focused on the package. "You mean materials like this?" Davidson took a step forward, his casual demeanor replaced by intense interest. "Where did you find that?" "The same place I found documents proving that Samuel Hartwell was working under government contract when he disappeared. If these materials were stolen, it wasn't by him." The two men exchanged glances that confirmed Thomas's suspicion that they knew more about Hartwell's fate than they were admitting. Reynolds moved to flank Thomas, a positioning that made the threatening nature of this meeting unmistakably clear. "Mr. Garrett," Davidson said, his voice losing all pretense of friendliness, "you're going to give us everything you found in that lodge, and then you're going to disappear from this area permanently. Those are your only options." Thomas backed toward the tree line, his mind racing as Davidson and Reynolds moved to cut off his escape routes. The confrontation he'd feared was happening, but he wasn't prepared for the level of organization these men displayed. They moved like professionals, coordinating their positions with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "I need time to consider your offer," Thomas said, trying to buy himself room to maneuver. "Time is something you don't have," Reynolds replied, producing a revolver from beneath his coat. "We know you've been exploring the underground areas. We know you've found Hartwell's cache. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or whether we'll have to search the property ourselves after you've had an unfortunate accident." Thomas was calculating his chances of reaching the forest when the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the clearing. Reynolds spun and dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder and cursing in language that would have shocked a cavalry sergeant. "That's far enough. Gentlemen?" The voice came from the tree line behind Thomas, calm and authoritative, despite the danger of the situation. "Mr. Garrett, please step away from those men and join me." Thomas moved quickly toward the voice, keeping his eyes on Davidson and Reynolds. Davidson had drawn his own weapon, but seemed uncertain about firing at an unseen opponent who'd already demonstrated superior marksmanship. The person who emerged from the trees surprised Thomas completely. Mary Collins was a woman in her 30s, dressed in practical traveling clothes and carrying a rifle with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her green eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Miss Collins," Davidson said through gritted teeth, "your interference here is most unwelcome. I'm sure it is. Mr. Davidson, especially since your employers specifically instructed you to avoid drawing attention to your activities." Mary kept her rifle trained on the two men while addressing Thomas. "Mr. Garrett, these gentlemen represent interests that have been searching for Hartwell's materials for over 20 years. They're not government agents, despite their claims. Who are you?" Thomas asked, though he was grateful for the intervention regardless of her identity. "Someone who's been researching the same mysteries you've stumbled into. I'm a historian with the Colorado Historical Society, and I've been investigating the disappearances at your lodge for the past 3 years. Reynolds was binding his wounded shoulder with a bandana, his face pale with pain and anger. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, lady. Those materials belong to people with the power to make you disappear permanently." "The materials belong to the American people," Mary replied firmly. "Samuel Hartwell was conducting legitimate government research that was compromised by private interests, seeking to steal strategic resources for personal profit." Davidson lowered his weapon but didn't holster it. "Miss Collins, you're operating on incomplete information. The situation here is far more complex than your academic research has revealed. I know enough. I know that Hartwell discovered deposits of rare earth metals that would have been worth millions even in 1868. I know that Confederate agents and foreign interests tried to compromise his operation. And I know that corrupt officials in the territorial government were working with private investors to steal those materials for themselves." Thomas listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The pieces of Hartwell's story were finally coming together, but the picture they formed was more complex and dangerous than he'd imagined. "The men who disappeared," Thomas said, "they were killed protecting Hartwell's research?" Mary nodded grimly. "Hartwell and his team discovered that their operation had been compromised. When they tried to evacuate with the materials and research, they were ambushed by people working for the same consortium these gentlemen represent." Davidson's expression had grown increasingly cold during Mary's explanation. "Miss Collins, your romantic notions about historical justice are irrelevant to current realities. Those materials have strategic value that extends far beyond academic interest. They need to be in responsible hands like yours." Mary's tone carried obvious skepticism. "Hands that have already demonstrated they're willing to kill to control them. Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary to protect larger interests," Reynolds said, his voice strained with pain. "Individual concerns must yield to strategic necessities." Thomas realized they were discussing his life as if he weren't present. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Davidson met his gaze directly. "We're suggesting that you turn over everything you found and relocate permanently to somewhere far from Colorado. In exchange, you'll receive enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And if I refuse, then you'll suffer the same fate as Samuel Hartwell and his associates. Some secrets are worth preserving regardless of the cost in individual lives." Mary shifted her rifle slightly, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by either man. "Mr. Garrett, there's another option. The Colorado Historical Society has resources to protect both you and Hartwell's legacy. We can ensure that his research reaches the proper authorities while keeping you safe from people like this." Thomas looked between the three people who were deciding his fate, understanding that his choice in this moment would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. The metal ingot in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as he weighed options that all carried deadly risks. "I need to see proof," he said finally. "Proof that you are who you claim to be, and proof that you can protect Hartwell's materials from people who've been willing to kill for them." Mary reached into her coat and produced a leather folder. "Everything I've discovered about Hartwell's operation is documented here. Names, dates, evidence of the conspiracy that cost him his life." She handed the folder to Thomas while keeping her rifle trained on Davidson and Reynolds. "But first, we need to get away from here safely. These men aren't working alone." Mary led Thomas back to the lodge through forest paths that avoided the main road, her movements sure and quiet despite the gathering darkness. Davidson and Reynolds had retreated after she'd made it clear that shooting Reynolds had been a warning rather than her best effort. But Thomas doubted they'd give up so easily. Once safely inside the lodge, Mary examined Thomas's discoveries with the trained eye of someone who understood their historical significance. Her reaction to Hartwell's coded journal was particularly intense, her fingers tracing symbols with obvious recognition. "This is remarkable," she said, studying the pages by lamplight. "I've seen references to this coding system in territorial archives, but I never expected to find an intact example." "You can read it?" "Some of it." "The cipher is based on biblical references, which makes sense given Hartwell's religious background." Mary pointed to specific symbols that appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. "These markings correspond to book, chapter, and verse numbers. Each biblical passage contains words that substitute for the coded symbols." She opened her own satchel and produced a worn leather Bible, its pages marked with numerous bookmarks and annotations. "I've been working on this puzzle for months, using fragments of Hartwell's communications I found in territorial archives. This journal should provide the missing pieces." Thomas watched as Mary worked through the code, cross-referencing symbols with biblical passages and slowly building a translation of Hartwell's final entries. Her concentration was complete, and he found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her green eyes and the determined set of her jaw. "Here," she said suddenly, pointing to a passage she'd decoded. "This entry is from October 10th, 1869, just days before Hartwell disappeared. Listen to this. The serpent has entered Eden. Harrison warns that territorial officials have been compromised by silver tongues from the east. Morrison and Reeves are moving the primary cache to the secondary location. I fear we have waited too long to act." "Silver tongues from the east," Thomas repeated. "Davidson and Reynolds, or their predecessors. This conspiracy has been active for decades." Mary continued translating, her voice growing more urgent as she uncovered Hartwell's final communications. "October 12th, Morrison reports strange riders watching the northern approaches. Reeves believes our rail shipments have been tracked. We are no longer safe here." The next entry made Thomas's blood run cold. "October 13th, they came in the night. Morrison and Reeves are dead, their bodies thrown down the old mine shaft to make their deaths appear accidental. I have sealed the primary cache and destroyed the rail access as planned. But they know about the secondary location. God forgive me, I must choose between my life and my duty." Mary looked up from the journal, her face pale in the lamplight. "Thomas, this man knew he was going to die. These final entries are instructions for whoever might find his work. She continued reading the decoded text. If Providence brings this journal to honest hands, know that the materials we gathered serve purposes beyond mere wealth. The metals we extracted contain properties that will one day revolutionize communication and transportation. They must not fall into the hands of those who would use them for private gain or foreign advantage. What kind of properties? Thomas asked, thinking of the strange blue-green ingots he'd found in the cave. Mary pulled a folded document from her satchel, opening it to reveal an official report stamped with government seals. This is a geological survey I found in Denver archives, filed by Daniel Reeves just weeks before his death. According to his analysis, the metals Hartwell was extracting contain elements that were unknown to science in 1868. The report was dense with technical language, but certain phrases stood out: unprecedented electrical conductivity, resistance to corrosion superior to all known alloys, and potential applications in telegraphic and mechanical engineering that could transform industrial capabilities. This is why people are still willing to kill for these materials, Mary continued. Reeves believed he'd discovered elements that could revolutionize technology. In the wrong hands, they could provide military advantages that would shift the balance of power between nations. Thomas studied the report, trying to understand the full implications of what Hartwell had been protecting. But why keep it secret? Why not turn the materials over to the proper government authorities? Because the proper authorities had been corrupted, Mary said grimly. Look at this final entry from Hartwell's journal. Agent Harrison brings word that officials in Washington have been compromised. The Secretary of the Interior has financial interests in private mining concerns. We can trust no one in official positions until this corruption is exposed. She showed Thomas another decoded passage. I am hiding this journal and the location of the secondary cache in places that only a true seeker will discover. The materials themselves I am entrusting to the mountain itself, in chambers that predate human presence in this valley. Let Providence determine when they should be revealed to honest men. Mary closed the journal and looked directly at Thomas. He's telling us where to find the real treasure, not just the materials you've already discovered, but the main cache that contains years of accumulated metals and research. But Davidson and Reynolds know about it too. They mentioned a secondary location. They know it exists, but they don't have the specific location. That information died with Hartwell's team. Mary picked up the Bible and began turning pages marked with Hartwell's annotations. But I think he left us a way to find it. Hidden in the margins of various biblical passages, Thomas could see faint markings in Hartwell's careful handwriting. Numbers, symbols, and what appeared to be geographic references were scattered throughout the book. Invisible unless you knew to look for them. He used his faith to protect his secrets, Mary said with obvious admiration. Every marking corresponds to landmarks and directions that would lead someone to the hidden cache. But you'd have to understand both the biblical references and the local geography to decode the route. Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and terror as he realized what Mary was suggesting. You want us to follow Hartwell's trail, to find the main treasure. I want us to complete Samuel Hartwell's mission, Mary replied firmly. Those materials need to reach people who will use them for the good of the country rather than personal profit. And the only way to ensure that happens is to find them before Davidson and his associates do. Outside the lodge, the mountain wind carried sounds that might have been natural or might have been someone moving through the darkness. Thomas and Mary looked at each other, both understanding that their time for planning was running short. The sounds outside the lodge grew more distinct as the night progressed, confirming Thomas and Mary's fears that Davidson and Reynolds hadn't retreated far. Through the window, Thomas could see the flicker of multiple campfires in the surrounding hills, suggesting their opponents had brought reinforcements. We need to move tonight, Mary said, studying Hartwell's biblical annotations by candlelight. Once they surround the lodge completely, we'll lose our chance to reach the secondary cache. Thomas gathered the most important documents, while Mary worked to decode Hartwell's final instructions. Her translation revealed a route that led deeper into the mountains, following landmarks that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the area's history. According to this, we need to find something called Jacob's Ladder, Mary said, pointing to a biblical reference Hartwell had marked heavily. In the actual Bible, it's the stairway to heaven that Jacob saw in his dream. But Hartwell's notes suggest it's a geographic feature about 5 miles northwest of here. I know that place, Thomas said with sudden recognition. There's a rock formation locals call the Devil's Staircase, a series of natural ledges that climb up the mountainside. If Hartwell was thinking biblically, he might have renamed it. Mary found additional clues scattered throughout the marked passages. From Jacob's Ladder, we follow the path of the prodigal son until we reach the Valley of Dry Bones. Then we look for Solomon's Temple, built into the living rock. The encoded directions painted a picture of a journey that would take them far from established trails. Through terrain that offered both concealment and danger, Thomas realized that Hartwell had chosen his hiding place not just for security, but for the natural barriers that would deter casual searchers as they prepared to leave. Mary showed Thomas one final entry she decoded from the journal. October 14th, I hear them coming up the mountain road. There is no more time. I have left final instructions in the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac. If I do not survive this night, may God grant that righteous hands find what I have hidden and use it to serve his purposes rather than man's greed. The place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, Thomas repeated. Mount Moriah. But there's no Mount Moriah in Colorado, Mary said, then paused as understanding dawned. Unless he meant a place that reminded him of the biblical location. Somewhere high, isolated, associated with sacrifice. Thomas felt pieces clicking together in his mind. There's a peak about 10 miles north called Sacrifice Ridge. Local legend says it's where the Ute tribe conducted vision quests, spiritual journeys that sometimes required great personal sacrifice. Mary nodded with excitement. That has to be it! Hartwell would have known the local legends, and the biblical parallel would have appealed to his sense of divine providence. They extinguished the candles and prepared to slip out through the lodge's rear entrance. But the sound of approaching horses made them freeze. Multiple riders were converging on the building from different directions, their coordination suggesting military-style planning. The basement, Thomas whispered, leading Mary toward the hidden entrance to the underground chambers. There's another way out through the tunnel system. They descended into the darkness just as heavy footsteps crossed the lodge's front porch. Thomas could hear voices discussing how to search the building systematically, confirming that Davidson had brought enough men to conduct a thorough operation. In the underground laboratory, Mary examined the equipment and documents that Thomas had discovered earlier. Her reaction to the metal ingots was particularly intense, her scientific training allowing her to appreciate their unique properties in ways Thomas couldn't. These aren't just rare earth metals, she said, hefting one of the ingots. The weight and coloration suggest they contain elements that weren't officially discovered until decades after Hartwell's time. He was extracting materials that science wouldn't understand for another 50 years. Above them, the sounds of searching grew more systematic. Men were examining every room, checking for hidden compartments and secret passages. It would only be a matter of time before they found the entrance to the basement. Thomas led Mary through the tunnel toward the natural cave system, carrying a selection of Hartwell's most important documents and one of the mysterious metal ingots. Behind them, lamplight began to flicker in the basement as their pursuers discovered the hidden chambers. They're in the basement, Mary whispered as they reached the cave entrance. But they don't know about the tunnel yet, Thomas replied, though he could hear voices growing closer. We have maybe 10 minutes before they find this passage. In the cave, they gathered supplies from Hartwell's stored equipment while the sounds of pursuit echoed through the tunnels behind them. Thomas selected items that would be useful for mountain travel: rope, a compass, tools for climbing, and provisions that had been preserved in the cave's constant temperature. Mary found something that made her gasp with recognition. Hidden in one of the equipment crates was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be Hartwell's complete geological survey of the region. The maps showed not just mineral deposits, but detailed topographical information that would make navigation much easier. "This changes everything," she said, studying the survey maps. Hartwell didn't just hide his treasure randomly. He conducted a complete geological analysis of the area and chose the hiding place. Based on scientific criteria, the portfolio contained additional documents that revealed the true scope of Hartwell's discovery. His surveys had identified multiple deposit sites throughout the territory, each containing different concentrations of the mysterious metals. The secondary cache wasn't just a hiding place. It was the central repository for materials gathered from dozens of locations. "No wonder they're willing to kill for this," Thomas said, examining inventory lists that detailed quantities of extracted materials worth millions, even by 1860s standards. "This isn't just about one treasure. It's about controlling access to strategic resources that could determine the outcome of future wars." The sound of boots in the tunnel made them both freeze. Their pursuers had found the passage and were following their trail toward the cave. Thomas and Mary gathered what they could carry and headed for the cave's rear exit, a narrow opening that led to the natural drainage system that had carved these chambers from the mountain. As they squeezed through the opening, Thomas heard voices echoing in the cave behind them. Davidson and his men had found Hartwell's storage area and were discovering the extent of what had been hidden beneath the lodge. "They know about the secondary cache now," Mary whispered as they emerged into a natural ravine that offered concealment but challenging travel. "Then we have to reach it first," Thomas replied, checking the compass and orientating himself toward the distant peaks where Hartwell had hidden his greatest secret. Behind them, the sounds of organized pursuit grew louder as Davidson's men realized their quarry had escaped and was heading deeper into the mountains. The race for Hartwell's legacy had begun in earnest, and Thomas understood that only one side would survive to claim the prize. Dawn found Thomas and Mary several miles from the lodge, following a deer path that wound through dense forest toward the rock formation Thomas had identified as Jacob's Ladder. They'd traveled through the night, guided by starlight and Thomas's growing familiarity with the mountain terrain that had become his home. The Devil's Staircase revealed itself as they crested a ridge, a series of natural stone ledges that climbed the mountainside like giant steps carved by some primordial hand. In the early morning light, Thomas could understand why Hartwell had renamed it with biblical significance. The formation did indeed resemble a stairway leading toward heaven. Mary consulted Hartwell's coded directions, cross-referencing biblical passages with the terrain before them. "From here, we follow the path of the prodigal son until we reach the valley of dry bones. According to the parable, the prodigal son wandered in foreign lands before returning home. Hartwell must mean we should take the indirect route. Instead of following obvious trails that led directly north toward Sacrifice Ridge, they chose a winding path that switchbacked through valleys and around peaks, adding miles to their journey but keeping them concealed from observation. The route demanded careful navigation, but it also revealed signs that others had passed this way before. Thomas found the first marker carved into an aspen tree about 2 miles from Jacob's Ladder. The symbol was subtle, just 3 intersecting lines that could have been natural scarring unless you knew to look for it. But when Mary compared it to markings in Hartwell's journal, the correspondence was unmistakable. "Trail markers," she said with excitement. Hartwell left a breadcrumb trail for anyone following his route to the secondary cache. They found additional markers at regular intervals, each one confirming they were following the correct path while providing navigation guidance for the challenging terrain ahead. The symbols were carved at eye level on trees and rocks, positioned so they'd be visible to someone traveling in the right direction, but nearly invisible to casual observers. The path of the prodigal son led them through increasingly remote wilderness, across meadows where elk grazed in morning mist, and through stands of pine that had never known the sound of an axe. But the beauty of their surroundings was offset by growing evidence that they weren't alone in the mountains. Around midday, Thomas spotted movement on a distant ridge, riders following roughly parallel course about a mile to the east. Davidson had apparently split his forces, sending trackers along multiple routes to prevent Thomas and Mary from reaching their destination. "They're herding us," Mary observed, studying the distant figures through a small telescope she'd brought from the lodge, "pushing us toward a specific route where they can control our movement." Thomas examined their options, comparing the terrain with Hartwell's geological survey. The path of the prodigal son continued northwest through a narrow valley that offered little concealment, but was the most direct route toward their ultimate destination. Alternative routes would take them through more defensible terrain, but would also cost precious time they might not have. Hartwell faced the same choice, Thomas realized, studying entries in the coded journal. He knew he was being pursued, but he couldn't deviate from the route without losing the markers that led to the cache. They pressed forward through the narrow valley, finding additional trail markers that confirmed they were following Hartwell's exact route. But the markers also revealed something troubling. Recent scratches on some of the carved symbols suggested that other people had found and studied them, possibly within the past few months. "Davidson's people have been here before," Mary said, examining fresh tool marks on one of the marker trees. "They've been following this trail, probably trying to decipher where it leads." The Valley of Dry Bones revealed itself in late afternoon, a desolate stretch of eroded badlands, where ancient geological forces had exposed layers of sedimentary rock containing fossilized remains of prehistoric creatures. The name was grimly appropriate, as scattered bones of various animals dotted the landscape, bleached white by decades of mountain weather. But it was here that Thomas and Mary found evidence of more recent tragedy. Hidden among the natural bone deposits were human remains, scattered and weathered, but still recognizable as the final resting place of men who had died violently. Scraps of clothing and personal effects identified them as the missing members of Hartwell's team, Morrison and Reeves. Mary said quietly, kneeling beside a skull that showed clear evidence of gunshot trauma. Hartwell was right about them being murdered. Among the scattered remains, Thomas found items that had survived the years: a surveyor's compass, still functional despite its exposure, a leather map case containing documents that confirmed these men's identities, and most significantly, a metal detector of unusual design that predated such technology by several decades. Hartwell's people were using scientific instruments that weren't supposed to exist yet, Mary observed, examining the detection device. This explains how they located the rare earth deposits so efficiently. The device was clearly handmade, constructed from materials available in 1868, but designed with principles that demonstrated understanding of magnetic and electrical properties beyond the era's conventional science. Whoever had built it possessed knowledge that was decades ahead of their time. As they prepared to leave the Valley of Dry Bones, Thomas spotted smoke rising from the direction they'd come. Their pursuers were closing the gap, probably less than an hour behind, and moving faster now that they'd picked up the trail. "Solomon's Temple," Mary said, consulting Hartwell's final directions. "It should be somewhere near Sacrifice Ridge, built into the living rock, like the original temple in Jerusalem." They climbed out of the valley as sunset approached, following markers that led toward the highest peaks in the area. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, echoing off canyon walls in the clear mountain air. The final marker appeared as they reached the base of Sacrifice Ridge, carved into a massive boulder that had tumbled from the peaks above. But this symbol was different from the others, more complex and detailed, incorporating elements that suggested both biblical and scientific significance. "We're close," Mary said, her voice tight with exhaustion and anticipation. Hartwell's greatest secret is somewhere on this mountain. Above them, the rocky peak rose into gathering darkness, its face scarred by natural caves and ledges that could hide treasures beyond imagination. But somewhere below, Davidson and his men were following the same trail, racing against time to claim prizes that had already cost too many lives. The climb-up sacrifice. Ridge revealed the true scope of Hartwell's operation as Thomas and Mary discovered a network of caves and passages that had been systematically modified for human use. Metal rings driven into rock faces provided anchor points for ropes, and carved handholds made otherwise impossible climbs manageable for someone carrying heavy loads. "This isn't just a hiding place," Mary observed as they followed a ledge that had been widened to accommodate pack animals. Hartwell created an entire infrastructure for moving materials up this mountain. The engineering involved was remarkable, showing understanding of physics and construction techniques that went far beyond what Thomas would have expected from a frontier lodge owner. Whoever Samuel Hartwell really was, he'd possessed knowledge and resources that suggested connections to much larger organizations. As they climbed higher, following markers that led toward the mountain's most inaccessible reaches, Mary made a discovery that explained much about Hartwell's mysterious capabilities. Hidden in a natural alcove was a cache of equipment that included surveying instruments, chemical analysis tools, and communication devices that were decades ahead of their supposed era. "Look at this," she said, examining what appeared to be a primitive radio transmitter. This technology wasn't supposed to exist until the 1890s, but the construction techniques and materials are definitely from the 1860s. Thomas studied the device, noting its handcrafted construction and the unusual metals used in its components. Some of the same blue-green materials they'd found in the lodge's basement had been incorporated into the transmitter's design, suggesting that Hartwell had discovered practical applications for his rare earth extractions. He was communicating with someone, Thomas realized, finding a logbook that recorded transmission times and coded messages. All this time, we assumed Hartwell was isolated up here, but he was part of a larger network. The logbook revealed communications with locations as distant as Denver, Colorado Springs, and even cities back east. The coded messages discussed shipment schedules, security concerns, and coordination with what appeared to be other extraction sites throughout the territory. But it was the final entries that sent chills down Thomas's spine. Hartwell's last communications described hostile contact and compromise of the primary network. His final transmission, dated the day before his disappearance, was a desperate warning. Mountain Gate compromised. All stations implement lockdown protocols. We'll destroy evidence and relocate to final cache. If communication ceases, assume operation terminated. Mary found additional equipment that revealed how Hartwell's network had operated. A primitive telegraph key connected to an elaborate antenna system allowed communication across vast distances, while chemical batteries provided power using reactions involving the rare earth metals he'd been extracting. "This explains everything," she said with growing excitement. Hartwell wasn't just mining valuable materials. He was part of a secret government program developing advanced technology using those materials. The communication network, the sophisticated equipment, the coordination with multiple sites. This was a classified research operation. The equipment cache also contained documentation that filled in missing pieces of the puzzle. Official orders, signed by high-ranking military officers, authorized the establishment of strategic material extraction sites throughout the Western Territories. The program was designated Operation Mountain Gate and carried the highest levels of government secrecy. But the documents also revealed why the operation had been compromised. Correspondence between Hartwell and his superiors discussed security breaches at the territorial level and unauthorized disclosure to private Interests, Confederate spies and foreign agents had infiltrated the program, but the greatest threat came from corrupt officials within the territorial government itself. Thomas read one particularly damning letter from a Colonel Morrison in Washington. "We have confirmation that territorial governor and multiple department heads are receiving payments from private mining consortiums. Your operation has been sold to the highest bidders. Implement emergency protocols immediately." As they absorbed the implications of these revelations, the sound of gunfire echoed from below. Davidson's men had reached the base of Sacrifice Ridge and were apparently encountering resistance from some unexpected source. "Someone else is on this mountain," Mary said, studying the muzzle. Flashes visible in the gathering darkness below. Through her telescope, Thomas could see figures moving among the rocks, engaging Davidson's forces with tactics that suggested military training. The firefight was brief but intense, with the unknown defenders demonstrating superior knowledge of the terrain. "Whoever they are, they're buying us time," Thomas observed as the gunfire moved away from the mountain's base. "We need to reach Hartwell's final cache before Davidson regroups." They continued climbing, following markers that led toward a cave entrance concealed behind a rockfall that appeared natural but showed signs of deliberate construction. The opening was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it led to passages that opened into chambers large enough to house significant operations. The first chamber they entered took their breath away. Carved into the living rock was a workshop that contained equipment more sophisticated than anything they'd found at the lodge. Electrical generators powered by chemical reactions provided lighting, while workbenches held instruments for analyzing and refining rare earth materials. But it was the communication center that truly revealed the scope of Hartwell's final preparations. Multiple radio transmitters connected to antenna arrays that extended deep into the mountain provided communication capabilities that could reach across continents. Maps on the walls showed transmission routes to locations in Europe, Asia, and South America. He was coordinating with international allies, Mary realized, studying the transmission logs. This wasn't just about protecting American interests. Hartwell was working with foreign governments to prevent these materials from falling into the wrong hands. A final logbook contained Hartwell's ultimate plans for protecting his discoveries. Detailed diagrams showed how he'd prepared multiple caches throughout the mountain, each containing different types of materials and information. If one cache was discovered, the others would remain hidden until conditions allowed safe recovery. But the most shocking entry was Hartwell's final decision about his own fate. Rather than attempt to escape with his life, he'd chosen to remain on the mountain and destroy any evidence that could lead enemies to his hidden treasures. His last entry was both confession and prophecy. "I have made peace with my mortality. The materials and knowledge must survive even if I do not. Future generations will need these resources to face challenges we cannot yet imagine." Above them, the sounds of approaching footsteps echoed through the mountain passages. Davidson had apparently found the cave entrance and was following their trail toward the communication center. The final confrontation was approaching, and Thomas realized that their survival depended on reaching Hartwell's deepest secrets before their enemies could claim them. The confrontation Thomas had dreaded finally materialized. As Davidson and three armed men emerged into the communication chamber, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the carved stone walls. Mary raised her rifle, but the cramped quarters and multiple opponents made their situation nearly hopeless. "Mr. Garrett, Miss Collins," Davidson said with cold satisfaction, "your mountain climbing expedition ends here. Please step away from those documents and surrender the materials you've collected." Thomas noticed that Davidson's force had been reduced from the larger group that had pursued them from the lodge. The gunfight at the mountain's base had apparently cost him several men, though the survivors looked professional and determined. "You're too late," Mary said. Her rifle trained on Davidson despite the poor odds. We've already documented everything about Hartwell's operation and your organization's involvement in his murder. Davidson smiled without warmth. Documentation is meaningless unless it reaches people with the authority to act on it. And I assure you, neither of you will be leaving this mountain alive to share your discoveries. It was then that Thomas noticed something Davidson hadn't seen yet. Among Hartwell's communication equipment was a device that was still functioning, its chemical batteries providing power to what appeared to be an active transmission system. Green lights indicated that the mountain's antenna array was operational and connected to distant receivers. While Davidson focused on Mary's rifle, Thomas quietly activated what looked like a recording device connected to the transmission equipment. If Hartwell's network was still functioning after 20 years, there might be people listening who needed to hear the truth about what had happened to the original operation. Your employers have been searching for these materials for decades, Thomas said, hoping to keep Davidson talking while the recording equipment captured his admissions. How many people have they killed to protect their secret? Dozens, Davidson replied without apparent concern. The strategic value of these materials justifies whatever measures are necessary to control them. Hartwell and his idealistic associates failed to understand that individual morality must yield to larger necessities. One of Davidson's men, Carter, moved to flank Mary's position while another, Jenkins, examined the communication equipment with growing alarm. "Sir, these transmitters are active. Someone might be monitoring our conversation." Davidson's confidence wavered as he realized the implications. "Shut down all communication devices immediately." But before Jenkins could reach the transmission controls, the chamber filled with the sound of approaching footsteps from multiple directions. The unknown defenders who had engaged Davidson's forces at the mountain's base had apparently followed them into the cave system. "Federal agents," a voice echoed through the passages. "Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Davidson's expression shifted to desperate calculation as he realized his situation had become untenable. "Carter, Jenkins, secure the exit passages. We're not leaving empty-handed." The ensuing firefight transformed the communication chamber into a chaos of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets. Thomas pulled Mary behind one of Hartwell's massive workbenches as federal agents engaged Davidson's men from the chamber's 3 entrances. The battle was brief but intense. Davidson's men were outnumbered and outgunned, facing opponents who demonstrated superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the cave system's layout. Within minutes, Carter and Jenkins were down, their weapons silenced permanently. Davidson himself proved more resourceful, using his knowledge of the chamber's layout to reach a defensive position behind the communication equipment. From there, he could control access to the deeper passages while threatening to destroy the irreplaceable historical evidence. "Agent Morrison, Department of the Interior," called the leader of the federal forces, a man whose voice carried authority despite the echoing distortion of the cave. "Mr. Davidson, you're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and you'll be treated according to federal guidelines for enemy agents." Thomas felt recognition click as he heard the name Morrison. One of Hartwell's original team members had been named Morrison, and the government correspondence they'd found mentioned a Colonel Morrison in Washington. The federal response to Davidson's activities had connections to the original Operation Mountain Gate. "Agent Morrison," Thomas called out, "we have documentation of the original government operation and evidence of the conspiracy that compromised it. Mr. Garrett, Miss Collins, please remain in defensive positions until we've secured the area," Morrison replied. "We've been tracking Davidson's organization for months, waiting for them to lead us to Hartwell's final cache." Davidson laughed bitterly from his position behind the communications array. "You're 20 years too late, Morrison. My employers have already extracted most of the valuable materials from this region. What's left here is just enough to eliminate the last witnesses to their activities." "Your employers underestimated Samuel Hartwell's preparations," Morrison called back. "And they underestimated the government's ability to maintain long-term operations despite temporary setbacks. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Davidson apparently calculating his options while federal agents positioned themselves for a final assault. But the resolution came from an unexpected source. Mary had been quietly studying Hartwell's control panels during the firefight, and she'd discovered something that changed the tactical situation completely. Hidden among the communication devices was a security system that Hartwell had installed to protect his final secrets. "Thomas," she whispered, "look at this panel." Hartwell rigged the entire chamber with explosives that can be triggered remotely. If we can't get the materials out safely, we can ensure Davidson's employers never get them either. The panel showed a complex array of switches and timers connected to charges placed throughout the mountain's cave system. Hartwell had prepared to destroy his life's work rather than allow it to fall into the wrong hands. And he'd left the final decision to whoever discovered his ultimate refuge. As federal agents prepared to storm Davidson's position, Thomas faced the same choice that had confronted Samuel Hartwell 20 years earlier: preserve the materials for future use by righteous hands, or destroy them forever to prevent their misuse by forces that had already proven their willingness to kill for profit and power. The standoff in the communication chamber stretched through the night as federal agents worked to position themselves for a final assault on Davidson's fortified position. Thomas and Mary remained behind the protective barrier of Hartwell's workbench, studying the explosive control panel that could destroy decades of scientific discovery with the flip of a switch. Agent Morrison approached their position during a lull in the tactical maneuvering, revealing himself as a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the field. His resemblance to the Thomas Morrison mentioned in Hartwell's documents was unmistakable. "Mr. Garrett, Miss Collins, I'm Special Agent Daniel Morrison, grandson of Thomas Morrison who worked with Samuel Hartwell in the original Operation Mountain Gate. My family has been protecting the government's interests in this matter for over 20 years, Thomas felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Your grandfather was one of the men who died protecting Hartwell's operation. He was murdered by the same organization Davidson represents, Morrison confirmed grimly. But before he died, he managed to get word to Washington about the conspiracy that had compromised the territorial government. The Department of the Interior has been conducting a long-term investigation ever since. Mary examined documents Morrison produced from his satchel, official papers that authorized federal intervention to recover stolen government assets and arrest individuals involved in the conspiracy. The investigation had identified multiple private organizations that had been attempting to locate and exploit Hartwell's discoveries. Davidson's employers aren't just treasure hunters, Morrison explained. They represent foreign interests that want to prevent the United States from accessing strategic materials that could provide military and technological advantages. They've been systematically locating and destroying evidence of government extraction operations throughout the Western Territories. The conversation was interrupted by movement from Davidson's position. The desperate man had apparently been exploring the chamber's deeper passages while maintaining his defensive perimeter, and he'd made a discovery that changed the tactical situation dramatically. "Morrison," Davidson called out, his voice echoing with renewed confidence. "You might want to reconsider your assault plans. I've found Hartwell's master control room, and I'm looking at enough explosives to bring down half this mountain." Through gaps in the communication equipment, Thomas could see Davidson had indeed found a passage leading to chambers they hadn't yet explored. Lights flickered in the deeper darkness, suggesting he'd activated systems that had been dormant for decades. "Your grandfather left quite a legacy, Morrison," Davidson continued mockingly. Hartwell prepared for every contingency, including the possibility that government forces might try to recover these materials. His final security protocol is designed to prevent anyone from claiming his discoveries. Morrison's expression grew grim as he realized the implications. Hartwell built a dead man's switch into his security system. If the materials can't be safely recovered by authorized personnel, the entire operation gets buried permanently. Mary had been studying the control panel more carefully, deciphering Hartwell's handwritten labels and technical diagrams. Her discoveries revealed the true scope of what the missing scientist had accomplished in his final months. "This isn't just about explosives," she said urgently. "Hartwell created a complete preservation system. Look at these readings. Some of the chambers are maintained under controlled atmospheric conditions, with temperature and humidity regulation that's kept his materials perfectly preserved for 20 years. The panel showed monitoring systems for multiple chambers throughout the mountain, each containing different types of materials and research data. Hartwell had essentially created an underground laboratory complex that could function independently for decades, waiting for the right people to discover and activate it. But Davidson's intervention had triggered security protocols that were designed to prevent unauthorized access. Warning lights on the control panel indicated that defensive systems were now active, and timer displays showed countdown sequences that would culminate in the destruction of everything Hartwell had worked to preserve. "Agent Morrison," Thomas called out, "Davidson has activated the security system. According to these displays, we have less than an hour before the entire complex self-destructs." Morrison studied the situation with the calculating mind of someone trained in crisis management. His next decision would determine whether 20 years of investigation ended in success or catastrophic failure. "Mr. Garrett, Miss Collins, I need you to help me understand Hartwell's control systems. My grandfather's notes suggested there were override codes that could disable the security protocols, but they required specific knowledge about Hartwell's scientific work." Mary examined the control panel's most complex sections, finding interfaces that require detailed understanding of Hartwell's coding system and scientific methodology. The override procedures weren't just about entering passwords. They required demonstrating comprehension of the principles behind Hartwell's discoveries. "It's like a final examination," she realized. Hartwell designed the system so that only someone who truly understood his work could gain access to his deepest secrets. Davidson might have found the control room, but he doesn't have the knowledge to use it safely. From the deeper chambers, they could hear Davidson's growing frustration as he struggled with control systems that required expertise he didn't possess. His attempts to force access were apparently triggering additional security measures, accelerating the countdown toward total destruction. "We have to reach the master control room," Morrison decided, "even if it means fighting our way through Davidson's position. The materials and research data in this complex are too valuable to lose to his incompetence." As federal agents prepared for a desperate assault, Thomas realized they were racing against time to save not just their own lives, but discoveries that could shape the future of American technology and security. Hartwell's final test was about to determine whether his legacy would survive. To serve the purposes he'd envisioned, the assault on Davidson's position came with desperate urgency as the countdown timer showed less than 30 minutes remaining before Hartwell's security system would destroy the entire complex. Federal agents coordinated their attack from 3 directions, while Thomas and Mary followed Agent Morrison toward the master control room where Davidson had barricaded himself. The passage leading deeper into the mountain opened into chambers that took their breath away. Hartwell hadn't just hidden materials in natural caves. He'd carved an entire underground facility from the living rock, complete with workshops, laboratories, and storage areas that represented decades of scientific advancement. The main chamber stretched the length of a city block, its ceiling supported by precisely fitted stone arches that demonstrated engineering skills far beyond what Thomas had expected from a frontier scientist. Electric lighting powered by Hartwell's chemical generators illuminated workbenches covered with equipment that Wouldn't be invented by conventional science for another 50 years, but it was the central vault that truly revealed the scope of Hartwell's discoveries. Behind massive steel doors that looked like they belonged in a bank rather than a mountain cave, shelves held row upon row of the mysterious blue-green metal ingots, each one labeled with detailed analysis data and potential applications. "My God," Mary whispered, studying inventory sheets that documented the vault's contents. "There are tons of refined materials here, plus research data that could revolutionize metallurgy, electronics, and mechanical engineering." Agent Morrison examined storage containers that held processed rare earth elements in various forms. Powders, alloys, crystalline structures and compounds that demonstrated Hartwell's sophisticated understanding of materials science. Each container bore labels indicating specific properties and suggested applications that read like science fiction. But their exploration was interrupted by Davidson's voice echoing from the master control room, now tinged with panic as he struggled with systems he didn't understand. "Morrison! Your grandfather's precious scientist was insane. These controls require equations and formulas that don't make sense." Through the control room's reinforced glass windows, they could see Davidson frantically working at panels covered with gauges, switches, and computational devices that combined mechanical engineering with electrical principles, decades ahead of their time. His attempts to override the security system were clearly failing, and the countdown displays now showed less than 20 minutes remaining. "Davidson," Morrison called out, "you're out of your depth. Surrender now and help us disable the security system. If this complex is destroyed, nobody benefits." "You think I'm stupid enough to trust federal promises?" Davidson replied, his voice cracking with stress. "My employers will kill me if I return empty-handed. At least this way, nobody gets Hartwell's discoveries." Thomas studied the control room layout through the windows, noting that Hartwell had designed multiple backup systems and redundant safety measures. The scientist had clearly anticipated that unauthorized personnel might attempt to access his final secrets, and he'd prepared accordingly. "Mary, look at these manual override procedures," Thomas said, pointing to instructions mounted near the control room entrance. Hartwell left detailed protocols for legitimate users to safely shut down the security system. The procedures required intimate knowledge of Hartwell's scientific work, including calculations based on the specific properties of the rare earth materials he'd discovered. But they also required physical keys that Hartwell had hidden throughout the complex, forcing potential users to demonstrate their understanding of his entire operation. Mary found the first key, hidden in a puzzle box that required solving equations related to the electrical conductivity of Hartwell's unique alloys. The second key was concealed in a mechanism that tested knowledge of the chemical properties that made his extraction processes possible. But it was the third key that revealed Hartwell's ultimate test of worthiness, hidden behind a panel that could only be opened by correctly inputting biblical references from his coded journal. The final key required understanding both his scientific work and his moral purpose in conducting it. He wanted to ensure that only people who shared his values could access his deepest secrets. Mary realized as she worked through the biblical cipher. The keys aren't just about technical knowledge. They're about demonstrating the wisdom to use his discoveries responsibly. As they gathered the three keys needed to override the security system, Davidson's situation in the control room became increasingly desperate. His random attempts to manipulate the controls had triggered additional defensive measures, and automated systems were now responding to perceived threats by accelerating the destruction sequence. 15 minutes, Morrison observed grimly, watching countdown displays that continued their relentless progression towards zero. "If we can't reach those override controls soon, everything Hartwell worked to preserve will be lost forever." The breakthrough came when Thomas found Hartwell's personal journal hidden in the master control room's outer chamber. The final entries contained detailed instructions for the override procedures, written in the scientist's own hand as a guide for whoever might eventually discover his life's work. To whoever finds this record, Hartwell had written, know that the materials and knowledge contained in this complex represent humanity's future as much as America's security. Use them wisely, for the power to create is also the power to destroy. And great discoveries in the wrong hands can bring catastrophe rather than enlightenment. The journal contained override codes that could disable the security system, but they required simultaneous activation from multiple control points throughout the complex. Even with the 3 keys they'd recovered, stopping the countdown would require precise coordination and perfect timing. As federal agents prepared to breach the control room where Davidson had barricaded himself, Thomas and Mary positioned themselves at remote control stations that could provide the coordination needed to save Hartwell's legacy. The race against the scientist's final security measure had become a test of everything. They'd learned about his work and his vision for how it should be used. With less than 10 minutes remaining before, Hartwell's security system would destroy the entire complex. Thomas and Mary reached their assigned control stations, while Agent Morrison's team prepared to breach Davidson's barricaded position. The override procedure required perfect synchronization between 3 separate control points, each operated by someone who understood different aspects of Hartwell's scientific work. Thomas found himself at a station that controlled the complex's power systems, facing panels covered with gauges and switches that monitored the chemical generators, providing electricity throughout the facility. Hartwell's journal had provided detailed instructions, but implementing them required understanding. The precise timing needed to safely shut down explosive charges without triggering accidental detonation. Mary's station controlled the atmospheric regulation systems that had preserved materials and documents for 20 years. Her task was more complex, requiring calculations that balanced pressure, differentials, and chemical reactions, while ensuring that sensitive materials wouldn't be damaged by sudden environmental changes. Agent Morrison had positioned himself at the master security console outside the control room where Davidson continued his desperate attempts to crack Hartwell's protective systems. His role required coordinating the shutdown sequence while simultaneously directing the tactical operation against Davidson. 8 minutes, Morrison announced, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. Mr. Garrett, Miss Collins, begin your preliminary sequences according to Hartwell's instructions. Thomas began the power regulation procedure, carefully adjusting chemical flow rates to the generators while monitoring electrical outputs that fed the complex's defensive systems. The process required gradual changes rather than sudden shutdowns, preventing power surges that could trigger the very explosions they were trying to prevent. Mary's work was equally delicate, managing atmospheric controls that maintained optimal conditions for Hartwell's preserved materials. Her calculations had to account for the complex chemistry of rare earth materials that could become unstable if exposed to sudden changes in temperature or humidity, but their progress was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the control room as Davidson apparently realized that his situation had become hopeless. Rather than surrender, he was apparently attempting to destroy the master controls that could save the complex. He's shooting the control panels. Morrison shouted over the noise of federal agents breaching the control room's reinforced door. If he damages the primary override systems, the automatic shutdown won't function. Through the control room's shattered windows, Thomas could see Davidson firing randomly at equipment he didn't understand, his panic overriding any rational assessment of consequences. Sparks flew from damaged circuits as bullets destroyed decades of careful engineering. Morrison's agents finally subdued Davidson, but the damage was already extensive. Primary control circuits that regulated the automatic shutdown sequence had been severed, forcing them to rely on manual override procedures that were far more dangerous and complex. 6 minutes, Mary called out, her voice tight with concentration, as she worked through backup protocols Hartwell had designed for exactly this situation. Thomas, I need you to manually balance the power systems while I try to stabilize the atmospheric controls. The manual procedures required Thomas to make constant adjustments based on real-time readings from throughout the complex. Without automatic regulation, he had to serve as the human equivalent of Hartwell's sophisticated control systems, making decisions that affected the safety of everyone in the facility. Mary's task was equally demanding, requiring her to calculate pressure and chemical balance adjustments while monitoring storage areas that contained materials capable of explosive reactions if mishandled. Her scientific training was being tested to its limits as she worked with technologies that shouldn't have existed in the 1880s. With 3 minutes remaining, they achieved the first stage of the shutdown sequence. Power levels throughout the complex began dropping to safe levels, while atmospheric systems stabilized the storage areas. But the final stage required something none of them had anticipated. Hidden in Hartwell's journal was a final entry that revealed his ultimate safeguard. The shutdown sequence could only be completed by someone who understood not just the technical aspects of his work, but the moral principles that had guided his research. The final override required inputting a code based on biblical passages that represented Hartwell's fundamental beliefs about how his discoveries should be used. It's a test of character, as much as knowledge, Thomas realized, studying the journal's final pages. Hartwell wanted to ensure that only people committed to using his work for good could access it. The biblical references required deep understanding of passages about stewardship, responsibility, and the proper use of knowledge and power. Hartwell had chosen verses that emphasized humanity's obligation to use gifts wisely rather than for personal gain or destructive purposes. With 90 seconds remaining, Thomas and Mary worked together to decode the final sequence, drawing on everything they'd learned about Hartwell's character and motivations. The scientist's test wasn't just about technical competence. It was about demonstrating the wisdom and moral commitment needed to handle discoveries that could change the world. Agent Morrison found the final piece of the puzzle in documents Davidson had scattered during his panic. Among Hartwell's personal papers was a will and testament that explained his ultimate vision for the materials and knowledge he'd preserved. To those who find this legacy, Hartwell had written, remember that great power brings great responsibility. These materials and this knowledge belong not to any individual or organization, but to all humanity. Use them to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to unite rather than divide. With 30 seconds remaining, they input the final codes based on biblical passages about stewardship and responsibility. The countdown displays flickered, hesitated, and finally stopped with 15 seconds still showing. Hartwell's ultimate test had been passed, and his legacy would survive to serve the purposes he'd envisioned. With Hartwell's security system safely disabled and Davidson in federal custody, the complex transformed from a death trap into a treasure trove of scientific discovery. Agent Morrison coordinated teams of specialists who began the careful process of cataloging and preserving materials that had waited 20 years for proper stewardship. Thomas found himself in the unexpected position of being consulted about every aspect of the recovery operation. As the legal owner of the property where Hartwell's work had begun, and as someone who had demonstrated understanding of the scientist's methods and motivations, his opinions carried significant weight with the federal investigators. Mr. Garrett, Morrison said as they toured the vast storage areas, the government is prepared to offer you substantial compensation for your cooperation in this matter. These materials and the research data have strategic value that could affect national security for decades to come. Thomas studied inventory sheets that documented tons of refined rare earth materials, research notes that contained scientific breakthroughs decades ahead of their time, and technological innovations that could revolutionize industries from communications to transportation. The monetary value was almost impossible to calculate, but it was Mary who found the documents that revealed Hartwell's true intentions for his legacy. Hidden in the scientist's personal effects was a detailed will that had been prepared just days before his disappearance, outlining specific instructions for how his discoveries should be used if he didn't survive to oversee them personally. "Listen to this," Mary said, reading from Hartwell's carefully written testament. "I direct that the materials and knowledge contained in my research facilities be used for the advancement of human knowledge and the improvement of conditions for all people, regardless of nationality or social position. No individual, corporation, or government should claim exclusive ownership of discoveries that belong to all humanity." The will went on to establish a trust fund that would support ongoing research while ensuring that breakthrough technologies would be shared with academic institutions, medical facilities, and other organizations committed to human welfare rather than military or commercial exploitation. Agent Morrison examined the legal documents with obvious concern. "Mr. Garrett, while we appreciate Hartwell's humanitarian intentions, the current strategic situation requires that these materials remain under government control. Foreign powers would pay enormous sums to access this technology." Thomas found himself in an impossible position, torn between federal demands for security and Hartwell's vision of open scientific collaboration. The decision he made would determine whether the scientist's legacy served narrow national interests or the broader humanitarian purposes for which he'd sacrificed his life. It was Davidson, now secured in federal custody but still present during the negotiations, who provided the perspective that helped Thomas understand the full scope of his responsibility. Despite his criminal activities, Davidson possessed detailed knowledge about the international conspiracies that had been seeking Hartwell's discoveries. "You naive fools don't understand what you're dealing with," Davidson said bitterly. "There are organizations throughout Europe and Asia that have been searching for these materials for decades. If you make them publicly available, you'll be handing technological advantages to America's potential enemies." But Mary had discovered additional documents that revealed the true extent of Hartwell's international connections. The scientist hadn't been working in isolation. He'd been coordinating with researchers in multiple countries who were conducting similar studies of rare earth materials and their applications. "Hartwell was part of an international scientific community," she explained, showing correspondence with colleagues in England, France, Germany, and even Russia. His vision wasn't about American technological supremacy. It was about collaborative research that could benefit all nations and prevent any single power from gaining dangerous advantages. The letters revealed that Hartwell's disappearance had been part of a coordinated effort to protect scientific discoveries from private interests and corrupt officials who wanted to exploit them for personal gain. His international colleagues had implemented similar security measures, creating a network of hidden research facilities throughout the world. "This changes everything," Morrison admitted as he studied the international correspondence. If Hartwell was working with foreign scientists on collaborative research, then his discoveries are already part of a larger body of knowledge that extends beyond American control. Thomas realized that the decision about Hartwell's legacy wasn't just about the materials hidden in the Colorado mountains. It was about whether scientific discovery should serve humanity's common interests or be controlled by competing national and commercial powers. The solution came from Hartwell's own writings, which outlined a framework for international cooperation that could protect strategic materials while ensuring their beneficial use. The scientist had envisioned a treaty organization that would oversee research and development while preventing any single nation or corporation from gaining monopolistic control. Hartwell was planning for a future where scientific cooperation could prevent wars rather than enable them, Thomas said. studying the scientist's detailed proposals. His legacy isn't just about materials and technology. It's about proving that human knowledge belongs to all humanity. As federal officials debated the implications of Hartwell's international vision, Thomas faced the final test of his worthiness to serve as guardian of the scientist's legacy. The choice he made would determine whether greed and fear would continue to drive technological development, or whether Hartwell's dream of beneficial cooperation could finally be realized. 5 years after Thomas Garrett purchased an abandoned lodge for his last 50 cents, he stood on the restored porch, watching visitors from around the world explore what had become the Samuel Hartwell International Research Institute. The crumbling building had been transformed into a monument to scientific cooperation and human ingenuity, drawing scholars, students, and curious travelers who came to learn about the man who had sacrificed everything to protect knowledge. From those who would misuse it, the decision to honor Hartwell's vision of international cooperation had taken months of negotiation between federal authorities, foreign governments, and academic institutions. But Thomas's insistence on following the scientist's original intentions had ultimately prevailed, creating an unprecedented model for collaborative research that transcended national boundaries. Mary Collins, now the Institute's director, emerged from the main building carrying a leather-bound guest registry that had become one of the facility's most treasured artifacts. The book contained signatures from Nobel Prize winners, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had come to understand how one man's courage had changed the world's approach to scientific discovery. "The delegation from the Royal Society is here for the afternoon tour," Mary said, her face glowing with satisfaction as she watched international visitors examine displays that told Hartwell's remarkable story. They're particularly interested in seeing the original underground laboratories. The mountain complex had been preserved exactly as Hartwell had left it, serving as both historical monument and active research facility, where scientists from multiple nations worked together on projects that served humanity's common interests. The rare earth materials Hartwell had extracted were being used to develop communication technologies, medical devices, and transportation innovations that were shared freely rather than hoarded for competitive advantage. Thomas walked through the lodge's main room, where displays showed how Hartwell's discoveries had contributed to advances in everything from telegraph systems to electric lighting. But the most popular exhibit was the recreation of Hartwell's study, complete with his coded journals and the biblical cipher that had protected his deepest secrets. In the years since the complex's discovery, scholars had decoded Hartwell's complete research notes, revealing scientific insights that were still decades ahead of conventional understanding. His work on electrical conductivity had led to improvements in power transmission systems, while his metallurgical research had produced alloys that were revolutionizing construction and manufacturing. But perhaps Hartwell's greatest legacy was the treaty organization he had envisioned, which now coordinated scientific research among nations that had once been enemies. The Hartwell Accords, signed by 17 countries, established principles for sharing technological discoveries while preventing their militarization or commercial exploitation. Agent Morrison, now retired from federal service, served as the Institute's security coordinator, ensuring that Hartwell's materials remained protected while still being accessible to legitimate researchers. His grandfather's sacrifice had finally been vindicated by the international recognition of Hartwell's humanitarian vision. "Thomas," Morrison said, joining him near the window that overlooked the valley where it had all begun, "we received word this morning that the Russian delegation will be arriving next week. They're bringing documents from their own archives that apparently reference Hartwell's international correspondence. The discovery that Hartwell's network had extended even further than originally known continued to surprise researchers. Each year brought new revelations about the scope of his vision and the extent of his influence on scientific development worldwide. As evening approached, Thomas made his customary walk to the small cemetery behind the lodge, where Samuel Hartwell's remains had finally been laid to rest with full honors. The simple granite headstone bore an inscription taken from the scientist's own writings: "Knowledge belongs to all humanity. Use it wisely." Beside Hartwell's grave lay the remains of Thomas Morrison, Daniel Reeves, and the other members of the original research team, their sacrifice finally acknowledged and honored. Fresh flowers appeared regularly on each grave, left by visitors who understood the debt they owed to men who had died protecting discoveries that were changing the world. Mary joined Thomas at the graves as the mountain sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that would have reminded Hartwell of the rare earth materials he'd spent his life extracting and studying. "Do you ever wonder what he would think of all this?" Mary asked, gesturing toward the busy research complex that had grown around his original lodge. Thomas considered the question while watching. The last tour group of the day examined the memorial garden, where plants from every participating nation grew side by side, symbolizing the international cooperation that Hartwell had envisioned. "I think he'd be amazed that his dream of peaceful scientific collaboration actually worked," Thomas replied. "But mostly, I think he'd be pleased that knowledge is being used to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm." As stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate poverty to stewardship of one of history's most important scientific legacies. His 50-cent investment had yielded treasures beyond imagination, but the greatest reward was knowing that Samuel Hartwell's vision of hope and cooperation would continue inspiring future generations. The lodge that had once sheltered secrets now welcomed the world, proving that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are found in the places nobody thinks to look, protected by people brave enough to sacrifice everything for principles that matter more than personal gain.